She was left in chains at an auction, humiliated, beaten, and forgotten until one quiet stranger stepped forward, unlocked her shackles, and changed everything. Fort Braxton, Wyoming Territory, February 1874. Winter did not relent that year. The cold clenched the town in its icy fist-piling snow against the false fronts of saloons and trading posts, filling every crack in the street with mud and slush. The wind carried a bite sharp enough to cut through wool driving grit against the shutters and rattling the loose boards of the old auction yard. The place had been set up on the far edge of town under a sagging canvas awning. Its wooden platform was slick with frost, the boards darkened by years of boots and spilled tobacco spit. The smell of pipe smoke and sour whiskey clung to the air, mixing with the heat of too many unwashed bodies pressed close together. Somewhere, a piano hammered out a crooked tune from a saloon, its notes barely heard over the din of men's voices and the occasional rattle of coins being counted out in rough hands. A sharp order cut the noise. "Bring her out." The gate at the side of the platform opened with a screech, and Clara Whitfield stumbled forward. Iron cuffs dug deep into her wrists, the chain between her ankles clinking as she shuffled. The iron was so cold it burned her skin, pressing into bruises that had not yet healed. Her dress, once pale blue, was torn at the hem, thin as parchment against the biting February air. Strands of hair hung loose across her face, whipped by the wind. A bruise darkened her cheekbone. She faltered at the step, nearly falling, and the crowd leaned forward to get a better look. The auctioneer, a stocky man with a voice sanded rough from years of shouting, jerked her upright by the arm, twisting her toward the bidders as though she were no more than cattle. "She's healthy enough," he barked. "Strong enough to work the kitchens or the fields. Who'll start me at $20? A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. Some men jeered, one whistled low. Another called out, "Turn her this way." Their eyes crawled over her, and Clara kept hers fixed on the boards beneath her feet. Jaw clenched, refusing to give them the satisfaction of tears. At the edge of the crowd, apart from the jostling and jeering, stood a man who said nothing. Jonah Mercer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat of dark fur. His hood hung back, showing a face carved hard by the wind and years of labor. A short beard shadowed his jaw, but it was his eyes that struck Clara when she dared glance up. Cold gray, steady, and watchful. They held no hunger, no pity, only a silence that seemed to take in everything. The auctioneer's chant rolled on. 35 who'll give me 40 voices," answered laughter rose, but Jonah's voice cut across them, low, firm, and final. "I'll take her." The air shifted. The auctioneer blinked, thrown off his rhythm, then recovered with a grin wide enough to show his tobacco-stained teeth. 40 it is. Sold. Jonah stepped forward without hurry, mounting the platform. He ignored the auctioneer entirely and turned to the guard holding Clara's chains. "Key." The guard scowled but handed it over. Jonah slid the iron into the lock at her wrists. A sharp click, and the cuffs swung open. He did the same at her ankles. The last length of chain fell with a heavy clang onto the frozen boards. Even the men in the back went quiet at the sound. Clara's hands were free. For the first time and longer than she could remember, she lifted her eyes. Jonah met her gaze calm, steady, unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and stepped down from the platform. His boots pressed deep tracks into the churned snow as he walked through the parting crowd and onto the main street. The wind caught at his fur collar, swirling white around him, and in moments, his figure blurred into the storm. Clara stood in place, stunned, her hands trembling where iron had been. The auctioneer already barked for the next lot, the crowd shifting and shouting, but she barely heard him. She stepped off the platform. Every movement felt unreal. The snow slapped at her face, sharp and stinging. She had nowhere to go, no coin, no name she could safely call upon, but she had something she hadn't possessed in years' freedom. The street had emptied quickly as the bidders sought the warmth of saloons and stoves. Clara wandered, clutching her arms tight across her middle. The wooden signs above shops creaked in the wind. An old woman in a patched shawl stepped from a doorway, and seeing Clara's state, pressed a wedge of coarse bread into her hand. "You look half-starved, child," she muttered before shutting the door against the cold. Clara stared down at the bread. She tore a piece, chewing, though she barely tasted it. Every direction seemed hopeless. Yet her thoughts circled back to the man who had freed her, the quiet one, Jonah Mercer, with eyes like steel under a fur hood. She remembered the sound of chains striking wood. Turning her back on town, she walked toward the trees. The snow deepened beyond the last building, swallowing her boots with each step. The wind funneled through the bare cottonwoods, cutting like knives against her cheeks. She followed what looked like a trail, perhaps made by trappers, though it quickly vanished into a hollow scoured by the storm. Hours blurred. The bread was gone. Her fingers grew stiff, her steps heavier. She stumbled, fell to her knees, pushed herself upright again. Her vision dimmed at the edges, the world shrinking to gray and white. Then she saw it. A flicker of yellow through the trees. At first, she thought it a trick of her eyes, but it steadied as she pressed on. The glow came from a small cabin tucked into a clearing, its roof banked with snow smoke rising from the chimney. She staggered up the porch steps and managed a weak knock before her knees buckled. The door opened. Jonah Mercer filled the frame, snow caught in his beard and hair, his shoulders blocking the storm behind him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped forward, caught her before she hit the boards, and carried her inside. Clara barely knew where she was as the heat struck her dizzying after the cold. All she knew was that the man who had freed her had found her again, and this time he did not walk away. The heat of the fire struck Clara like a wave dizzying after the brutal cold outside. Jonah lowered her into a sturdy wooden chair near the stone hearth. Flames leapt high, painting the log walls in shades of gold and shadow. The sudden warmth made her shiver, every nerve thawing at once, the sensation almost unbearable. She clutched the blanket he wrapped around her shoulders as though it were a lifeline. Jonah said nothing at first. His movements were calm, deliberate, each action done with care rather than haste. He crouched at her feet and began to unlace her boots stiff with ice. Clara flinched out of habit, but his touch was steady, not cruel. He peeled away her sodden stockings, exposing toes white with numbness, then set her feet close to the fire's glow. From the stove, he fetched a small kettle steam curling from its spout. Pouring dark liquid into a tin cup, he pressed it gently into her hands. "Drink," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an edge of command that left no room for argument. Clara obeyed. The tea was bitter and hot, scraping warmth back into her throat. She kept her eyes lowered, uncertain whether to thank him to speak at all. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of fire and the low hiss of wind slipping through the shutters. Jonah did not pry. He did not ask her where she had come from, or why she had risked wandering into the wilderness alone. He only added another log to the fire and glanced once at her face to make sure she was steady in the chair. For Clara, who had grown used to suspicion, interrogation, or worse, that silence felt foreign. It was not the silence of indifference, but of restraint. Over the following days, the rhythm of Jonah's cabin became hers. The small room was modest, but kept with care, a heavy plank table shelves lined with tools and dried herbs, a bedroll neatly tucked by the far wall. Clara moved hesitantly at first, but Jonah never barked at her when she reached for things. She offered help where she could, sweeping the floor, mending a tear in an old curtain, fetching water from the snowmelt outside. The first real bond between them came over supper. Jonah had returned with the snowshoe hair, its fur still bright against his gloves. Clara watched as he cleaned it at the table, his hands practiced. After a pause, he looked to her. "You want to try?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. He guided her grip on the knife, his touch light never forcing. When her hands faltered, he pulled back, letting her continue on her own. Their fingers brushed more than once, fleeting and unspoken. By the time the hair was simmering in broth, the cabin smelled of herbs and salt. Clara felt for the first time in years that she had done something that mattered. That night, as they ate, she dared ask the question that had burned in her since the auction. "Why did you walk away that day? You freed me, but you didn't ask for anything in return." Jonah set down his tin cup, his gray eyes fixed on the flames. "Because no one should owe for their freedom," he said. His tone was calm, but the words carried weight that lingered between them long after he'd fallen silent again. Clara didn't know what to say. Gratitude caught in her throat, tangled with suspicion and something more fragile, hope. The snow outside did not ease, but within the cabin life grew steadier. Each morning, Jonah tended his traps, his rifle slung across his back, while Clara tried her hand at simple chores, sweeping ash, sorting herbs, learning to mend clothes with rough stitches. He never demanded, only showed her quietly how things were done, letting her learn at her own pace. Then came the day of the bear. The woods were silent under their heavy blanket of snow as Clara followed a few steps behind Jonah. He moved with the quiet precision of a man who had spent most of his life in the wilderness step pause scan. Clara carried a small sack for kindling and whatever else they might gather. For a time the rhythm was steady, almost soothing, until it broke. A guttural growl rolled low from between the trees. Clara froze, heart hammering. From the shadows lumbered a massive black bear, its winter coat bristling its head, swinging toward them. Jonah reacted instantly, raising his rifle. The crack of the shot shattered the stillness, but the bullet only grazed past splintering bark behind the beast. The bear roared and charged. Jonah reloaded with speed born of practice, but Clara knew it wasn't enough. The animal was closing too fast. Her eyes dropped to the snow. There beside his last trap lay Jonah's short-barreled pistol, half buried in white. Without thinking, she lunged. Her gloves brushed the grip, pulling it free. She raised it with both hands, arms shaking the bear's massive form, filling her vision. She aimed at the broadest part she could see its shoulder and fired. The recoil jolted her, the sound ringing in her ears, but the bullet struck true. The bear stumbled, its charge broken. Jonah seized the chance, lifting his rifle again. His second shot was clean final. The animal collapsed in the snow with a heavy thud. Silence returned, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing. Clara realized she was still clutching the pistol, her hands trembling. Jonah stepped beside her, lowering his rifle now, and studied her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since she had met him, his mouth curved into a real, unguarded smile. "You kept us both alive," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes held something new recognition. Respect. The knot of fear in Clara's chest loosened. She had come into these woods certain she was nothing but a burden. But now, standing beside Jonah Mercer with the smoking pistol still in her hands, she knew she had proven otherwise. They lingered there in the snow, the silent trees standing witness, before Jonah took the pistol gently from her grip and slid it back into his belt. "Let's get this done," he said, nodding toward the path home. For Clara, the snow no longer felt quite so cold. She followed him back toward the cabin, each step lighter than when she had begun. The storm had calmed to a dull hum by the time they returned from the woods. Clara swept melted snow from her skirt while Jonah set the bear hide near the door to dry. The cabin felt warmer than before, not just from the fire but from something unspoken that had shifted between them. Clara had not expected him to smile, had not believed a man like him even could. That small flicker of warmth had taken root inside her, stubborn against the wind. The days that followed fell into a rhythm again. Clara grew steadier on her feet, learning the cabin's quiet order. She noticed things she had not before: the rows of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the neat stack of sharpened knives above the counter, the desk in the corner with its worn surface and tin cup of pencils. It was there, while dusting one afternoon, that she discovered the drawer. It slid open with a creak she hadn't intended. Inside lay only a few items: a folded piece of parchment, a small carved bird of wood, and a scarf. The scarf drew her hand before she could stop herself. Its wool was frayed at the edges, the once bright cream now faded, but it had been carefully folded, cared for far beyond its years. Clara lifted it, running her fingers across the loose weave. A faint scent of cedar clung to the fibers. It was delicate, clearly belonging to someone who had treasured it. The door opened behind her. She turned quickly. Jonah stood framed by the snowlight, his shoulders heavy with the day's cold. His eyes dropped at once to the scarf in her hands. The change was subtle but sharp. His jaw tightened, his stride slowed. "I was just dusting," Clara began, her voice low, apologetic. "I didn't mean." "It's fine," Jonah interrupted, though his tone was heavier than usual. He stepped forward, taking the scarf from her with careful hands, almost reverent. For a long moment he said nothing, only traced his thumb over the frayed fringe. Then, as though the words cost him, he spoke. "It belonged to my sister." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't expected that, hadn't expected him to offer anything at all. He kept his gaze on the scarf as he continued. "She was younger than me, head full of stubborn ideas, always running ahead. I left one winter to check traps farther north, thought I'd be back in a few days. When I returned," his voice faltered, then steadied. "She was gone, sold off while I was gone, to a place in town no one speaks of without shame." The fire cracked loudly in the silence. Clara's throat tightened. Jonah's voice dropped further. "I found her weeks later in the middle of a blizzard. She'd run. But the cold—" He stopped, shaking his head slightly, unable to finish. The scarf crumpled faintly in his grip. "She wore it every winter," he said almost to himself. "It's all I had left." Clara understood then the way he had appeared at the auction, the immediate release of her chains, the quiet distance he kept. It wasn't just kindness. It was a vow forged in loss. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice unsteady. Jonah finally lifted his eyes to hers. Something unguarded flickered there, raw and fleeting. "Don't thank me," he said simply. "I wasn't going to let it happen again." Without thinking, Clara stepped closer, her hand brushing his fingers against the roughness of his skin. She didn't try to speak further. There were no words big enough for what he carried. The touch was enough. He did not pull away. The air between them had shifted. The silence was no longer a barrier. It was an understanding. That night, the change was tested. The fire had burned down to embers, the cabin steeped in shadow, when a sound pierced the stillness. A bark, sharp close, followed by another. Jonah froze his hand, still on the leather strap he had been mending. Clara looked up from the quilt she was folding. "What is it?" she whispered. Jonah raised a hand for silence. Outside, the barking grew louder, joined by the crunch of boots over snow. Not one set many. Too many for travelers. His voice dropped low. "They've found us." He crossed swiftly to the gun rack, lifting his Winchester. With deliberate care, he blew out the lamp, plunging the room into shadow. The glow of the embers painted the cabin in dim orange. "Stay low," he told her, his tone calm but urgent. The first shot cracked through the night, shattering a window pane. Jonah dropped to one knee, firing back through the gap with precision born of long practice. A shout echoed, then retreating steps, but more came. Shadows moved in the tree line, slipping between shadows. Bullets slammed into the walls, splinters flying. Jonah fired again, each shot measured. Clara pressed low against the door, heart pounding. Then a cry tore the air. Jonah staggered back, his rifle clattering to the floor. Clara saw the dark bloom spreading across his shoulder. "You're hit?" she gasped. "I'm fine," he gritted out, snatching his revolver with his good hand. Another crash rattled the door. Clara saw the hunting knife on the shelf. She seized it just as the door burst inward an inch. With a cry, she drove the blade hard through the gap. A curse rang out from the other side, followed by the frantic retreat of boots in snow. Jonah kept firing, forcing the attackers farther into the woods. Their shouts faded, one voice calling, "Town's too close, we'll come back." Then silence broken only by their own harsh breathing. Clara dropped the knife and rushed to Jonah. His revolver hung limp, his breathing uneven. Blood soaked his shirt too quickly. "Sit down," she ordered, surprising even herself with the firmness of her voice. He didn't argue, frightening in itself. She guided him to the table, tearing the cleanest cloth she could find and pressing it hard against the wound. His jaw tightened, a hiss slipping between his teeth. "It's just a graze," he muttered. She shook her head fiercely. "You've lost too much blood for it to be just anything." Her hands trembled but held steady, keeping pressure as the cloth warmed under her palms. She could feel her own heart hammering in her ears. Jonah's gaze locked on hers, unflinching, even through the pain. "You should have let me take the first shot," she whispered, half to hide the break in her voice. His mouth curved faintly, almost a smile. Couldn't risk it. Tears stung at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, tying the bandage firm. "And I couldn't risk losing you." The fire had nearly gone out the cabin, sinking into darkness. But Clara stayed at his side, one hand firm over the bandage, the other braced on the table. Outside, the mountain night closed in cold, vast, merciless. But inside, for the moment, the danger had passed. Morning came slow, the kind of pale light that crept between the shutters after a night of gunfire and fear. The storm outside had eased, but inside the cabin, the air carried the sharp smell of smoke, sweat, and dried blood. Clara sat beside Jonah at the table, unwinding the stiff bandage from his shoulder. The cloth peeled away with reluctance, sticky and dark where blood had clotted through the night. The wound was no more than a deep graze, but angry and swollen. Clara worked carefully, her hands steady now in a way they hadn't been during the fight. She warmed water over the hearth, dipped a strip of linen, and pressed it against the broken skin. Jonah winced, but he didn't complain. His eyes stayed on her, calm even in pain. "You could have left me," Clara said softly. Her words hung between them like smoke, heavy and uncertain. Jonah's jaw flexed, but his voice was steady when he answered. "I've lost enough. I wasn't going to lose you." She tied the fresh bandage with deliberate care, her fingers brushing his skin. It was the closest either of them had come to confession. Gratitude swelled in her chest, but she said nothing. The silence itself felt like something sacred, an understanding born of blood and fire. Jonah healed slowly, though his strength returned by inches each day. At first, he could barely lift a log, but stubbornness carried him outside where he stacked wood with his good arm. Clara met him at the door, shouldering half the load without being asked. He raised an eyebrow at her determination, but he didn't stop her. Through the week, the cabin became more than a shelter. It became a place where two lives began to fit together. Clara kept the hearth burning, swept the boards, and mended what she could with rough stitches. Jonah showed her how to split kindling and sharpen a knife properly. He never ordered, he only demonstrated and then let her learn. For the first time in years, she felt like more than a burden. When the wound no longer throbbed with each movement, Jonah suggested they take a walk. They stepped outside into a world washed clean by snow, the pines sagging under white. Breath puffed in the cold air rising in clouds. The ridge cut dark against a sky so clear it seemed brittle. Clara looked south where the land dipped beyond the trees. "We could do better in the valley," she said. "Soil we can work. A place that isn't always fighting the wind." Jonah followed her gaze. "There's water down there, a creek that runs year-round, cottonwoods along the banks. We could fence a few acres, plant potatoes, beans, corn, stable a horse if the hay holds." Clara smiled faintly. "And a window facing east so the morning light finds the kitchen." He studied her a moment before nodding. "East it is." They didn't speak of a house or a home directly, but the idea took root as surely as any seed. When Jonah's shoulder bore weight again, they descended the mountain together. The South Valley opened before them in wide curves, a creek threading silver through the willows. Even in winter, the land looked alive, waiting for spring. On the rise stood a small church and graveyard. Jonah slowed near the fence. Clara felt the shift in him and took his hand without asking. His grip was firm, steadying himself as much as her. They stopped at a weathered cross carved with a single name, Anna Mercer. The dates beneath it told of a life cut short a winter claimed too soon. Jonah's face hardened, but he said nothing. Clara knelt brushing snow aside and gathering a handful of violets she found clinging to the thaw. She placed them at the base of the marker. "She'd be proud of you," she whispered. Jonah's fingers tightened around hers, not as a man clinging to grief, but as one who had finally found someone willing to carry it with him. They stood in silence, the wind tugging at their coats before turning toward town. Fort Braxton looked different in daylight than it had that night at the auction. The muddy main street bustled with wagons and horses. Women carried baskets between shops. Children trailed at their heels, and men leaned on hitch rails discussing cattle prices. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer rang from down the street steady and sure. They stepped into Carter's general store, greeted by the bell above the door and the smell of burlap lamp oil and flour. Jonah set a list on the counter: 2 sacks of seed potatoes, a bushel of beans, a hammer nails, wire latches, and a pane of glass. His voice was calm, practical, the voice of a man planning to stay. "Startin' a place?" Mr. Carter asked, weighing nails on the squeaky scale. "South Valley," Jonah said, "near the creek bend." The storekeeper's brows lifted. "Good land there. Won't starve you if you tend it right." Clara wandered the shelves, fingers brushing paper packets of seeds. She added 1 packet of carrots. Jonah gave a single nod, making room for it on the counter. Then he surprised her. From a shelf stacked with folded fabric, he chose a dress of sky blue cotton, crisp and new. He laid it gently beside the tools. "For the lady of the house," Carter said with a smile. Heat flamed in Clara's cheeks. She touched the fabric as though it might vanish. Jonah didn't explain himself, didn't need to. The look he gave her was enough. They loaded the wagon with what supplies they could haul and turned back to the valley. Clara rode with the folded dress in her lap, touching it every so often to reassure herself it was real. The path curved through snow-thinned meadows and bare cottonwoods until Jonah drew the wagon off near a rise above the creek. They marked the ground with willow stakes pacing out spaces for a kitchen, a bedroom, and a pantry. Clara spoke measurements aloud while Jonah drove each stake firm into the soil. Together, they set the wide-paned window against a tree. The glass caught the sun and glowed a square of light in the cold. Clara folded her arms, staring at the staked outline. "We're not just building walls," she said. Jonah's gray eyes softened. "No, we're building a life inside them." The valley wind carried their words as if promising to keep them safe. For the first time since the auction, Clara let herself believe the future could belong to her. Spring came at last to the Wyoming Valley. The thaw poured silver water down the slopes, feeding the creek until it sang over smooth stones. Wildflowers burst into color, purple, lupine yellow buttercups, pale blue flax bending under the breeze. The cabin, once only a refuge against winter, now stood as the heart of something new. Its walls were firmer, its roof patched tight, and its windows open to the east, so sunlight spilled across the table each morning. Clara stepped onto the porch, a basket of seedlings on her arm. The air smelled of wet earth and pine rich with promise. She watched Jonah returning from the tree line, a bundle of cut timbers balanced on his broad shoulder. His stride was steady, the strength in it no longer shadowed by pain. Behind Clara, a small burst of laughter rang out. "Papa, look!" cried their 4-year-old son Samuel, darting past her legs with a wriggling puppy in his arms. The pup yipped its tail, wagging furiously as Samuel skipped across the grass, giggling at his own game. "Careful," Sam Jonah called, lowering the timbers to the ground with a solid thud. His gray eyes, once so cold, softened every time they landed on the boy. Clara smiled, setting the basket aside and stepping forward to lift one of the beams. Together, she and Jonah carried the wood inside. They were adding a new room, Samuel's room with its window facing the sunrise so the first light of day would spill across his bed. The days grew rich with rhythm. Jonah built Samuel a bookshelf, carving little animals into the wood with the same care he once used to sharpen his knives. Clara knitted a blanket dyed deep green, like the valley lake in summer. Samuel helped plant flowers along the porch, his small hands dark with soil, his grin wide as he declared each row perfect. Evenings found the family seated together, the fire crackling, the pup curled beneath Samuel's chair. One twilight, Clara and Jonah sat on the porch, while Samuel rolled in the grass chasing the dog until both collapsed in laughter. The sky blazed with molten gold, shading into rose and violet as the sun sank behind the ridge. Samuel scrambled up and laid his head in Clara's lap, eyelids heavy, cheeks still flushed from play. Jonah reached over, his hand warm on her shoulder. "We've come a long way from that day at the auction," he said quietly. Clara's fingers brushed over Samuel's hair. "And we're never going back." Jonah nodded. From his pocket, he drew a small silver bracelet. 3 letters were etched into the band J, C, and S. He placed it gently on Clara's wrist. "This is for the family we built," he said. Samuel stirred, blinking sleepily at the bracelet. "That means we're together forever, right?" "Right." Jonah answered, his voice steady but softened in the way it only was for them. Seasons turned. The valley grew abundant, its soil answering the labor of their hands. The cabin expanded an extra room, a wider porch, a garden fenced against deer. Samuel grew fast racing through the fields, learning to fish the creek with his father and gather herbs with his mother. The pup grew too faithful as a shadow, never straying far from the boy's side. Clara often thought back to the bitter day of chains and jeers, to the weight of iron on her wrists. The memory still burned, but it no longer owned her. That sound of shackles striking wood had become in her heart the beginning of freedom. Jonah had given her that gift, and together they had built something greater than either could have managed alone. Jonah, too, had changed. The man who once carried grief like a stone now carried his son on broad shoulders, laughter rumbling from his chest. His silence had not disappeared, but it had softened, filled now with comfort instead of walls. When he tended the garden or mended the fence, Clara could see in his face that he no longer lived only with ghosts. He lived for the life they had made. One evening in late summer, the three of them sat outside as the sky turned indigo. Fireflies blinked across the meadow, and Samuel chased them until he dropped into the grass, pointing upward at the stars. Clara leaned against Jonah's side, her hand resting on the silver bracelet. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "what might have happened if you hadn't spoken that day? If you hadn't raised your hand at the auction?" Jonah was quiet for a moment. Then he answered, "I don't let myself, because what matters is here. You, him, this place." He nodded toward Samuel, who was now curled in the grass with the dog at his side. "That's enough for me." Clara's chest swelled with something she could only call peace. A peace she had thought she would never feel again. Life is not always kind, and the West less kind than most places. But from cruelty they had carved compassion. From loss they had forged family. The cabin stood not only as shelter, but as proof that freedom once seized could grow into love strong enough to weather any storm. And so it was that in the shadow of the mountains, with fields of wildflowers at their feet and stars wheeling overhead, Clara, Jonah, and little Samuel built a life worth remembering. This story reminds us that the past does not have to define us. Chains can be broken, grief can be carried together, and even in the harshest wilderness, love and trust can build a home. Clara and Jonah's journey is proof that freedom means more when shared, and that peace is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of family courage and hope. If this tale touched you, share your thoughts below. What does home mean to you? Leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West stories of grit, heart, and the kind of love that outlasts every storm.